This episode is proudly supported by Montague, handpicked for you.
So the eating experience of our plums is sweet. That's a primary driver. It's got to be sweet, but it's also got to have enough acid, because the mix of acid and sugar is what gives fruit its flavour. And in a plum, it tends to be slightly higher acidity. And then a really nice, full, not dry, but juicy explosion of juice into your mouth as you bite into it. That's nirvana for us in terms of plum.
For more information, go to montague.com.au.
So I used to shuck oysters at Chelsea Market on the King's Road, and we do like 2,000-3,000 a day there. And 50% of the people would be like, "Where are these from? Are they French?" And then he'd be like, "No, they're from 50 miles east of here."
This is Fishtales, a seafood podcast. I'm John Susman. Is the oyster not the quintessential seafood? Defining of its origin, luxurious, sweet, salty, rich and delicious. Exotic yet simple, the oyster reflects the mood of its environment on any given day, with flavour and condition literally subject to the weather, water, and even the time of day. The oyster is one stable creature in an otherwise completely changing estuary environment. It's almost impossible to draw precise comparisons between oysters, even of the same species, raised in one estuary to those raised in another. When it comes to exploring oysters, there are interesting parallels drawn to the world of wine. And like the specialists in the world of wine, the negociant or the sommelier, there are too a small but growing group of oyster experts who've spent years, and in some cases a lifetime, exploring, learning and defining the extraordinary world of oysters. Bobby Groves is one such authority. He is an acclaimed oysterman, author and enthusiast. He's worked across the world as an oyster curator and shucker for various restaurants, markets and oyster bars, shucking thousands of oysters a day. These days, as the head of the oysters at London restaurant group Chiltern Firehouse, he is one of the world's leading authorities on this amazing bivalve.
So my name is Bobby Groves. I'm an oysterman from Essex, England, and I'm based in London, where I shuck oysters at a restaurant called Chiltern Firehouse, and I'm the author of a book called Oyster Isles, A Journey to England and Ireland's Oysters. So I grew up 48 miles east of London on the Essex coast in a town called Maldon, Maldon. It's famous for sea salt, and it's also famous for a rich oyster heritage. So the neighbouring farm to ours was an oyster farm, and when you grow up in the rural sort of East Coast, you end up doing lots of different jobs, from grain carting or ploughing fields or working on the vineyards and the oyster industry. And the one that I did the most of, because they were family friends, was working at a place called Maldon Oysters, which actually is quite a big oyster farm, and it ships all over the world. So my first job was down on the prom, down on the quayside, in a place called the Hythe, which is an old English word for harbour. And I was running the oyster shack down there and selling cockles, whelks, oysters, jellied eels, some wet fish, and then crab and lobster in season. So I was about 16 when I was running that shack for them, and then moved on to work in the at the oyster farm. So I'd be an oyster boy down on the beach, and they have like a rack and bag aquaculture method down there, and then into the purification plant, and then delivering up into London, and that's pretty much where it all started. So it's about 17 years in the oyster industry now. So that's when I was a kid in my teenage years. Because Maldon is about 50 miles east, 48 miles as the crow flies. You've got it's in that strategic position, like the famous place Whitstable, which is on the southern side of the River Thames. We're on the north side. So this whole area, the southeast of England, is uniquely located to get good access using the rivers and historically the railway and carting stuff along the roads, and boating out towards France as well. So it's a huge concentration of oysters down there because it's brilliantly located for the continent and for the capital. So my job really was quite traditional in a sense, where I was driving pallet loads of oysters in boxes of 50, or if I was going to the airport and shipping them out to Asia in huge boxes of 200, and I'd drive up the A13 was the road for about half an hour into a huge market called Billingsgate Fish Market, which is the historic London fish market, drop off loads of stuff there. And because I was there during daytime and it's a nighttime market, I had no help getting the pallets off with the pump trucks or any of the machines. So I had to physically unload these pallets onto new pallets by hand. Once I'd done the market, I would then drive into the city, and I'd do about 30 odd restaurants, and that's going into the belly of the beast of huge banks in Canary Wharf with all their private kitchens. It would be going into the back of Bentley's restaurant, Jay Sheeky, all of these famous oyster houses in London, and I'll pop out the other end. So I'm wiggling through the whole city, and then pop out the other end, hoping that I hadn't screwed up any order and I'd have to go back. And then I'd get out to Heathrow, drop off a pallet load there for shipping across, to Hong Kong or to Rungee's market in Europe, and then drive back. So it was a huge day. Not all the days were like that, obviously, and Christmas was like 10 times worse than that. But yeah, that's what a oyster on the east coast of England, oyster fishery on the east coast of England does when it's that close to London. You really make a lot of drops in London. It's fantastic. You do it by hand as well. I think now they do it Tuesday and Friday. I used to clock in at 8, pack all the oysters with the oyster boys from the purification tanks into boxes, load the van. They'd stop and have a cigarette break, and then I'd bloody go and do the whole city of London. So I was the lackey that had to go and do it all.
Having learned the oyster farming craft, Bobby's enthusiasm to inspire and motivate people to enter the wonderful world of oyster appreciation found him at the famous Borough Market, shucking oysters and telling stories about the provenance, history, and in the enjoyment of oysters.
So the bit between the oyster fishery, so I need to differentiate between fishery and farm. I also did a bit of work for West Mersey, a family on West Mersey, which is an island at the end of the River Blackwater where my farm was based. And they are 8th generation oyster fisherers. And they are they're the fishery, and I was on the farm. So there's aquaculture at Maldon, and there was fishing and wild hand picking at West Mersey. So yeah, I did a bit of work for them. They have a market stall in Borough Market, which is right by London Bridge station, and that's our famous sort of ready-to-eat market, if you like. So Billingsgate's the wholesale, and then Borough is the big sort of touristy one, and they've got a wonderful market there, a wonderful stall there where they're doing like 3,000 oysters a day and clams and stuff. So I sort of gravitated between, I went from Maldon to helping these guys out at the stand, and crucially started my own sort of events business, which was just named after me, Bobby's Oysters, which was just shucking in London. And then that put me in the city and in amongst it all, and I moved up from Essex to London. I think when you're in a position or in an industry long enough, you soon start to work out where your strengths are or what you enjoy doing the most. And I found when I was delivering the oysters, I really loved that engagement between the chefs and me doing the delivery, or speaking to the clients. And if you were going in the front door, which is the case with Bentley's Oyster Restaurant in Piccadilly, you'd end up speaking to guests, and I really loved that interaction. So I found out then that I was more client facing than I thought I was. So I started to do more the service end, and I think that's a huge part of it, isn't it? I mean, that's what we celebrate, isn't it? The actual engagement between farmer and consumer, and it's just really interesting. You never know where it's going to go. So that's essentially how that happened. And then there's a couple of years later, crucially, I was down at the market. I found out that a restaurant in Marylebone, so in West London, uptown, that was looking for an oyster. They wanted to do an oyster cart, like a concept, like an old Victorian costermonger style cart. And I just threw my hat in the ring after doing, I think it was the Saturday before Christmas. I did about 3,000 oysters down at the market. And I threw my hat in the ring, said, yeah, I can do this for you. And we had a quick meeting with the chef. The chef at the time was a guy called Nuno Mendes, and the head chef was Patrick Powell. And we sat down. I didn't take a CV in or anything. I just sort of sat down on the counter and just showed them a picture of the oyster farm and said, this is what I do and this is where I come from. And they gave me the gig. And now, 8 years later, we are... here we are. So it was turned from a quick pop-up to now a serious oyster cart that does good numbers and is quite well respected. So that's it went from Borough Market and then to opening the Raw Bar at Chiltern Firehouse in Marylebone.
A British food critic famously said of the fashionable London restaurant Chiltern Firehouse that the place seems to be almost permanently accessorised by Kate Moss. It's no surprise then that an enthusiastic, passionate oysterman like Bobby should put his roots and oyster knife down there.
So we're open every single day of the year, and we pretty much do a service from, so like a 12-hour service from 11 to 11 or 11 till close. It can drag on a bit at the end. We have one guy standing out there, me, 90% of the time, and we shuck to order oysters, a variety of oysters. I think I've got 20 on the system that I can pull from, but at any one time it's normally about 3 or 4, depending on what's available seasonally. We do crudo clams as well, the cherrystone clam or hardshell clam, and we do crudo scallop, and we do caviar. So it's a sort of 3 foot by 4 foot oyster cart that looks like a Victorian sort of traditional costermonger cart, stainless steel worktop, and then a lovely big trough, a well for all the oysters to sit in, and then we dress it up like a sort of Parisian oyster display, and then we just shuck to order. So at any one time, you could have like one ticket come through if it's 11 a.m. on a Sunday, because everyone wants to eat pancakes, not oysters. But then by the time it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you're knee deep in about 4 to 10 tickets, of which that could be a a la minute slicing scallop to shucking 24 rock oysters, or popping open a caviar that you've got to run into the kitchen and plate up with the bellinis from the chefs. It can be like the notch can be turned up to 10, or it can be like quite measured. So it's ebbs and flows, but we do about 160,000 oysters off it a year, which if you're looking at somewhere like Borough Market, they're doing 3,000 a day. That's not as much as what they're doing at all. But considering we've got a brasserie menu and a hotel and snacks for the hotel lobby, there's lots of different things that are on offer there. But the oyster cart is a dedicated oyster cart, and I get to sort of apply my aquaculture knowledge to what the oyster meats are like throughout the year and stuff, to make sure we've got the best stuff on there at all times.
One of the exciting aspects of running a specialty oyster program is the opportunity to curate an exciting range of species from different regions and growers by season.
So famously, we've got what we call the native oyster, the Latin Ostrea edulis, the European flat oyster, available September through to April. Stocks are quite low this year and the last couple of years, and in general, the wild beds have been obliterated because of overfishing around the turn of the century. But we've got this gorgeous native oyster that, when it's available and there's enough stock to harvest some, and the price is more expensive to the buyer, to me, we've got this fantastic flat oyster. So it's if no one's seen it before, to describe it would be like a little disc, like a flat oyster, not deep like your rock oysters. It's a flat disc, sort of brown shell in appearance, quite flaky shell, and the meat is sort of tan brown colour, and it generally, obviously it depends on where it comes from, but generally you've got a much more sort of gamey, mineral, strong, earthy flavour compared to a rock oyster or a Gigas oyster. The only way to describe it, if no one's ever tasted one, is if you had a rock oyster and a native oyster next to each other, the rock oyster would be chicken and the native oyster would be rabbit or pheasant or something like that. That's how you'd compare the meats. So it's highly prized and very precious. And if there's not enough in the river, then we just leave it. But we have that gorgeous native oyster. The other species that we have a lot of here is we call it a rock oyster, but it's not a Sydney rock. It's a Pacific rock oyster, Chrysostria gigas, and that's the one that we brought over, a couple hundred years ago, and really it sort of took off in the 1960s when hatchery technology took hold. So everyone started messing around with rock oysters because the government wanted to prop up the oyster industry in the 60s in the UK and Europe. So we had rock oysters en masse, and they tested them in labs and tested them in the wild, and it was a viable commercial product. And really in the 1980s and 90s is when it sort of became more and more available. And now it's the most popular oyster here. I think globally it's something like 80 or 90% of oysters consumed is actually the Gigas species. So we have those two species, and within those species, I mean, there's a number of farms and fisheries that I can pull from.
The renaissance of appreciation for oysters worldwide has spurned an explosion in the number of farmers who are exploring ways to manage their crops by estuary, species and season, and are sending them to market, often branded, with a clear definition of how the unique terroir from which they have come can influence the flavour and texture and ultimately the enjoyment of the oyster.
We in the UK there's more and more projects springing up around the coasts with oyster restoration. That's a big thing. There are more farms happening as well. There's sort of new farms, a bit like in the States where they hand out leases, like 10-acre leases in Long Island Sound in New York. Like you get a lot more new farms and new brands within that. So there's the old 2,000-year-old Colchester and Whitstable sort of Roman thing going on, but then you've got brand new producers just sort of starting up, buying some seed, and then within 1.5 to 2 years they've got a product and a brand. So I'm really enjoying the sort of branding thing. Like I think I'd probably attribute it to America and their thriving oyster industry, but that whole appellation thing where you've got brand new names and people having fun with it, and within the brand and the oyster farm, they actually have brands and different sort of ways of marketing them. So if there's a different sized oyster, they'll call it a different thing, but it's actually the same oyster from the same farm, and one's 120 grams and one's 80 grams. But it gives a restaurant or a consumer an option, and it's a nice thing. So I really like that. It's really progressive and moving forward. The oyster restoration thing, I'm trying to do it in London at the moment by sending our shells back to the East Coast and letting them sit on the beach side and bleach in the sun for a couple of months under the UV so that they're purified, if you like, before they get dumped back in the river to help baby oysters settle on them. So oyster restoration is a big thing. It's very difficult, the logistics, to get a transport company to take loads of smelly oysters from a restaurant back to a beach, but we will get there. But it's happening elsewhere. Glenmorangie, the whiskey company, is working in the Dornoch Firth in Scotland, just on the west coast. A couple of Forth up, just above the Forth. They're working, and they've got the backing and the finances to work with Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh to properly repopulate the Locke there, and that's happening all over really. Galway's doing it. It's on the south coast of England. They're doing it. And they're promoting eelgrass growing back again, and banning dredging in certain areas. And I think that's really good and really progressive.
Oyster farming is a demanding, often lonely, with no downtime kind of job. The farmer spends long hours in all types of weather, tending his crop to ensure it's in the best condition before it goes to market. The reward for an oysterman like Bobby is the opportunity for him to explain directly to his customers how, where and when the oysters came from, despite what he went through to get them there.
I think going back to the oyster farm days, Christmas at the oyster farm, that's a fantastic experience. It's so visceral and such hard work. It's like, I think one of my standout experiences was actually like when it was -2, and we from the oyster, between the oyster farm and the purification tanks, there's a big holding tank that's outside at Maldon Oysters, and you've got 5,000 oysters in there at one time in orange aquaculture boxes of 200, and I just remember leaning into that, holding onto the side, hoping that I wasn't going to fall in. And I had all of the gear on, all of the aquaculture sort of Guy cotton oilskins on, and boots and gloves and every possible bit of PPE and protective wear that I could have. But I lost the use of my hands because it was so cold, and my hand was going repeatedly into this sort of freezing cold water, and the only fingers that would work were my thumb and my index finger. So I remember doing a whole day lifting out huge sort of like 40 kilo, 50 kilo orange boxes of oysters with just 2 digits, and then putting them into the purification tanks and just doing it over and over again. I mean, that's one thing. And then I remember at the end of the shift sort of secretly hating my colleagues because I was the young lackey that was doing all of that. And then we just all skated along the tarmac, which was just covered in ice, and then just skated along to the pub. And I remember that being quite a nice experience in hindsight. It reminds me of that sort of Bob Cratchit from Muppets Christmas Carol, sort of packing up for Christmas and like doing just sort of. That reminds me of. I always remember that. And then in Borough Market, we would have a lot of Taiwanese and Chinese, Korean and Japanese tourists, because Richard Howard's Oysters used to have a Taiwanese employee who used to shout about it a lot, and then got the word out to the other countries that I mentioned. And whenever any of those people from those countries would visit, they would always pull up by the coachload, and they would order massive oysters. And so in the UK, we go for like a 90 gram, 100 gram oyster, which is, sort of average market size oyster. And then what I learned in my market days is that in that part of Asia, oysters is sort of bread and butter out there, isn't it? It's much more part of cooking and part of sauce making, and people loved the huge oysters. So every time we saw a coach turn up, we knew that we had to get the orders would be big. It'd be like 18 large. So you'd be shucking 18 times 150 gram oysters with this knife, trying to prise open this gnarly little shell, and you'd be sent down, and you'd be in the weeds immediately because you'd have a huge queue, and the notch went from 0 to 10 in like 2 seconds. So that's another and they're not the sort of glitzy experiences that you probably want to hear about, but that's definitely part of the job. And just to talk briefly about my other work is that I go to the restaurant I work with. They have 2 other hotels in America, one in Hollywood and one in Shelter Island, which is at the end of Long Island, just north of the Hamptons. So I'm lucky enough to have the opportunity to go to those places, and we've built raw bars in Hollywood, and we're building one in New York State at the moment. So I guess my true, the experiences I treasure the most are the ones where I'm standing in Hollywood at an oyster cart and working with products that I would never dream of working with, a local Carlsbad oyster farm, or something from like the north of Canada where it's like really cold waters, tiny little rock oysters, or something from the Puget Sound near Seattle. Well, that's the true gift. Or like a massive scallop. They always have huge sea scallops over there, which are like twice as big as the king scallop that we have here in the UK. So if I'm slicing a nice crudo scallop there, it's It feels like a computer game, or like a Champions League football match where you're playing the game in a different stadium. It's like it feels like that. And then in New York, it's just unbelievable because Long Island Sound is just must be about 400 producers in that area alone. And then the oyster book that I did, I went to about 40 oyster farms in the UK and Ireland.
Bobby's knowledge of all things oysters has been captured in the definitive book about the oysters of England and Ireland. Entitled Oyster Isles, it's an oyster travelogue, a one-of-a-kind piece that shines a spotlight on the extraordinary and the everyday of the industry. It's the stuff that oyster bucket lists are made of for any oyster enthusiast.
So Essex is famous for this sort of like wide boy Range Rover gangster thing. And every time I say an oyster is from Essex, wherever I am, if I was on the market stall, if I'm at the cart in London or wherever, someone might make a joke saying, oh, do these oysters have fake tan? And I literally had this so much and I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my God. So I used to shuck oysters at Chelsea Market on the King's Road, and we do like 2,000-3,000 a day there. And 50% of the people would be like, where are these from? Are they French? And then you'd be like, no, they're from 50 miles east of here. And then you'd talk about the Roman heritage and everything like that. And I sort of got tired of doing it my whole life. And then when I was in London shucking, I'd have a lot more interaction with international guests. So the three things that made me do the book, one is I was fed up of justifying where I'm from because it's such a rich history, and the sort of the stereotypical picture of the Essex boy is just a part of the story. It's a brilliant part of the story, but it's just a part of the story. Secondly, people always ask for French oysters, and I think France is like the fourth biggest producer in the world or something. But crucially, when Britain overfished their oysters at the turn of the century, the French government, whoever was in power at the time, all the Napoleons said, we might need to conserve our oysters as a source of food for the villages and to get them into the cities. So there was always some element of conservation or rationing when it came to oyster farms in France, which has a lot to do with why they're so famous for it, because London, New York and Paris in the Western world were huge oyster powerhouses in the 1890s and 1880s. London then slipped away when we overfished everything at the onset of train travel and industrialization. And, we then became not famous for oysters. And it's really annoying because where I come from, there's Roman heritage. So Essex boy thing, the French thing, and then lastly, I was just like, I saw it happen across the board. Like, I remember one guy from Dubai flying in and be like, where are these oysters from? And I'd be like, oh, these are from England. It's like, are they not polluted? And even though it's a sort of tongue-in-cheek comment, and only one person made that comment, I've had others a bit like it. And I was like, bloody hell, like, we've got grade A waters around, we're surrounded by like 18,000 kilometers of coastline. Like we've got good oysters. So I was on a bit of a mission to change that narrative. And crucially, I don't think anyone had got on the back of a Triumph Bonneville and gone round 5,000 miles on their days off and gone and done the actual visits.
With a keen sense of pride for the range of oysters across the UK, Bobby's approach to collecting the stories from the farms, the farmers and the oysters themselves was to jump on a motorbike, a classic English motorbike at that, to explore the world of oysters in the British Isles.
I reached out to Triumph and said, I've just landed this book deal. Are you interested in letting me ride a bike so I can, I wanted to do it on a bike because I thought it'd be a nice affordable way to do it and easy access down to the beaches and stuff, because I know how inaccessible oyster farms can be. And I phoned up Triumph and they ummed and ahed a little bit and then said, can you tell us more about the book? And I said, I'm basically going to go and see loads of oyster farms and fisheries and it's never been done before. I think Triumph would work quite well because I'm British, it's a British and Irish project, and Triumph are quintessentially British. I think they're built in Leicestershire, aren't they? So I asked them and they said, yeah, have a T120. So Triumph Bonneville T120, and then it was two-tone green and white, and I parked it in London and then left from London, started in my hometown in Maldon, and then I went all around the UK anti-clockwise. So did the east coast north of the Thames, round East Anglia, all the way up to Lindisfarne, just north of Newcastle, into Scotland and up to across to the Hebrides. You have to get a little boat to go across the water body to see all the peaty islands like Islay, where the whiskey comes from. They've got really peaty oysters there. Down to the Cumbria and the Lake District. Then I went down to Wales and I crossed into Ireland, went clockwise from County Wexford all the way around to County Louth through Northern Ireland, back into Scotland, and then went down to the south coast and then did Cornwall, which is beautiful and famous for native oysters, the Fowl Estuary, where you can only fish for oysters under manpower, sail and oar, no motorboats allowed there. Did the whole south coast, popped over to the island of Jersey and Guernsey, and finished in Whitstable, which is the world famous Royal Whitstable native oyster fishery. And so I did Kent, which is that county, last, not because Essex and Kent hate each other. So I did Essex first and Kent last, but I did it because I wanted to start where I was born and where I was from, just so it worked with the narrative, and finish with the most famous place. So that's how that all worked, and it was bloody brilliant.
Oyster appreciation is beautifully subjective and often fluid and mercurial. The vast array of flavours and textures of oysters from different regions in different seasons is a constantly changing landscape, which is what makes them so culinarily exciting. Trying to nominate one single specific oyster as a favourite can, for a seasoned oysterman, be an almost impossible task.
Yeah, there's one standout oyster at the moment that's just consistently good with the meat content and quality, and lasts a long time. So it's from Carlingford in Ireland, from Carlingford Locke. That's on the east coast of Ireland, just 50 miles north of Dublin, and it's the border runs through the middle of the Loch from Northern Ireland to Republic. So on the Republic side, you've got Carlingford Oysters, and within their farm, they're a big farm, they do rock oysters. They have a percentage of their farm which is given over to actually it's an Australian technique, the swinging basket, which tumbles the oyster, and they named their premium oyster or their especial oyster after themselves. So the farmers are Mary and Kean Louis Pfizer, and their premium oyster is just knocks it out of the ballpark at the moment. You can serve it all year round, and it's absolutely fantastic. And because it's grown in these swinging seeper baskets, they get this really deep shell, and the meat fills the shell, so you've always got a shell packed full of meat. So the premium Carlingford oyster has to be my top oyster at the moment, but I'm always loyal to my East Coast guys like Brancaster, Butley Creek, West Mersey, Colchester and Maldon. These guys, you've got a sort of an estuary, sort of brackish vegetal sort of finish to them, because there's a lot of sort of sweeping marshland out there, whereas the Carlingford oyster is right out in the Irish Sea getting battered by the waves.
Bobby Groves is at the vanguard of the exciting movement which is the oyster professional, constantly challenging farmers to produce better quality whilst concurrently encouraging consumers to explore the world of oysters. His enthusiasm, commitment and outright love of his work is a true inspiration for oyster lovers across the world. This is Fishtales, a seafood podcast. A Deep in the Weeds production. I'm John Susman. Follow us on Instagram at Fishtales Seafood Podcast, or email us at fishtalespodcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay tuned for more tales from beneath the surface of the seafood world every Friday on your podcast app.